Hi, everybody. Welcome. Nice to see so many of you. Thanks for coming to our discussion this week of Out of the Past, a film selected by my colleague, Jacob Mazer, who is here with me as well. And we really look forward to discussing this exceptional film noir with you. Those of you who've been with us before know the procedure, but we'll go over it again anyway. Please keep your audio on mute unless you are speaking. You will know that it is your turn to ask a question or make a comment because I will call on you. How will I know to call on you? You can use the raise hand feature. It's a little blue hand. It says raise hand. It's in the participants box. You can see a symbol of it, an example of it there down on the bottom of our screen now. And if you do that, I will call on you to ask your question or make your comment. We also have the chat going, and my colleague Jill is monitoring that. And if you're from outside the Philadelphia region, we'd love for you to introduce yourself there and say where you're from. And in addition, you can chat with other participants in the discussion as well. And if anything really pressing comes up there, a topic Jacob and I just have to tackle, Jill will certainly let us know. And that's about it. We are ready to start, it appears. And let's see. Joss, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I'm a little bit unprepared because I expected David to be there first, but I got my licks in. I've,
I'm here waiting.
yep, excuse me, have never seen this film before, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Watching all the noir elements develop themselves, but as Jacob said in his wonderful introduction, there are some differences here. So it struck me, and maybe there are more than two, but there are at least two different subgenres, it seems to me. One, the detective novel, which the detective noir, which Jacob described nicely with Raymond Chandler's quote. And then there's the one where some other guy gets sucked in to some nefarious scheme. I'm thinking in terms of Double Indemnity, or the more modern noirish film Body Heat, which was like Double Indemnity Redux. And this one was sort of a hybrid, it seemed to me. You have all the detective stuff and the hard-boiled dialogue and the trench coat and the fedora. But then this character, Robert Mitchum's character, is also getting sucked in to this nefarious scheme. And that was a little different. I didn't expect that. Anyway, I just wondered if either of you wanted to comment on that observation and see what you think.
Well, thanks for that observation, Joss. I'll jump in. I'll say that I honestly, I think there is a distinction to be made, as you say, but I don't entirely agree with you in its nature. I do think there are times when the protagonist, for lack of a better term, of the film is the detective or a police detective. And then there are times when he is of another profession where he doesn't typically unravel mysteries, like you said, Double Indemnity, or The Postman Always Rings Twice. But the place I disagree with you is that I think that whether it's a detective or not, the man still gets sort of hooked, right? If you think of Maltese Falcon, it took Bridget O'Shaughnessy to kind of hook Humphrey Bogart in that movie. Here, I guess it does start out because Mitchum's sort of following orders or took a job, but he gets hooked by the woman as well. And that's where things start to get really interesting, so to speak. So I agree that they're not all detectives, but I think one of the core elements is that the man sort of gets hooked. And I don't say that in any way to absolve him of responsibility. It's aspects of his character that allow him to get hooked in the first place. Jacob.
Yeah, I have a different take. I tend to think the comment is I think you've identified, Joss, a dichotomy that has legs. You know, I think the genre of noir, for me in general, whether it is sort of in the hard-boiled detective sort of subgenre, or whether it or otherwise in stories like Double Indemnity or others, universally the genre tends to deal with this sort of what can we say, with disillusionment, a sort of journey through the underworld, often crime, and corruption and so forth. To me, one of the sort of interesting, dichotomies in noirs, we have, I think, a body of, texts or films where our protagonist is sort of an outsider to the intrigue. He's somebody who gets called in from the outside, and we sort of follow him on a journey, through this world, through this underworld. And then we have, other types of noir, like you said, Double Indemnity, Scarlet Street, with Edward G. Robinson is another one that comes to mind, where the protagonist really is the subject of the intrigue. We really, instead of following a sort of outsider into the underworld, into an intrigue that is really not his own, we have characters who are really themselves experiencing entrapment, who are really themselves experiencing confinement, and really themselves experiencing the sort of malefactors of the, post-war, disillusioned, corrupt, world of noir. And what's interesting about Out of the Past, where it sort of synthesizes those two, is initially it seems like this is going to be a detective movie. Mitchum is called in to investigate this case, which really doesn't have anything to do with him. He's a hired hand. But it turns out that he gets, sucked into the mire. And as I said in my intro, the intrigue really becomes his intrigue. So I think, to me, I think that is I think you're onto something.
David, your question or comment?
Yeah, I have a couple. First of all, I appreciate that you selected this, Jacob, for us. I have not watched enough of the Mitchum movies, and I'm really glad to have gotten this exposure. I was reminded at the very end of a quote that my father-in-law used to use a lot. It was really about opera. Everybody but the ushers died at the end. And that was sort of a very slight surprise. And I would like you to comment a little bit on the women. Your opening gave us an awful lot of other background, but I was interested in your thoughts. First of all, I felt like Anne was a bit of thread that kept tying pieces of this together. She literally took Robert Mitchum from place to place several times. But at the end, she was the piece of thread that was sort of remained. And I viewed the women here as very interesting characters, but at the same time, she sort of got the right guy at the end, which to me was a little different from a noir type of film. I appreciate your comment on the women tying in and how you view that comment. And thank you again.
Jacob, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think this is a big topic, and I imagine we'll return to the subject throughout our conversation. I'll make a couple comments in brief. First of all, I think one pattern that we see through the film is sort of doubles or repetitions. And then we often have characters or types where we see sort of two different versions, or, part and counterpart. And so, there's many throughout the film, and we can continue to talk about them in our discussion. But one, there's certainly this dichotomy set up between Kathy, who is the love interest in sort of one version of Robert Mitchum's, life and history, and we have Anne, who is the love interest in this other, this other reinvention of himself. And the way that he interacts with the two women comparatively, I think tells us a little bit about his psychology and his pathology and why he acts the way he does. One of the things that's curious about the film, about Mitchum's, or I should say Jeff's decisions, is that Anne seems like a catch, and Kathy is trouble. So why does he keep going back to Kathy? There are several different there are several different points in the film where he sort of swears his allegiance and his love to Anne, but as soon as Kathy pops up, he's drawn right back towards her. That repeats itself several times throughout the film. And one of the things that strikes me is that for a character like Jeff, and we can talk about why this is, but Anne can't ever really measure up to Kathy because Anne's devotion to him is too complete. Whereas with Kathy, there's this sort of part of her that's always sort of out of reach. There's something that's always obscure. And to him, I think that's what makes her alluring. The object of desire is always a little bit more alluring to certain people when it's a little bit out of reach. There's this, expression, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. But for Mitchum, I think maybe a bird in the bush is worth two in the hand. He's tantalized, by her just because she's sort of unpossessable in this way that Anne isn't. So that's one way that I would distinguish between the two, and one way that I would see them relating to each other, and how that ties into the thematic core of the film. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Andrew.
Well, one of the things I find interesting is that there's, a number of these movies have, the film noir formula is sort of one woman and she's a bad woman. Then you have the film noirs, and I'm thinking of something like The Big Heat, where you have women on sort of a spectrum of badness, but none of them is perfect except for one who isn't in the movie very much. The thing that struck me about this movie is that Anne is a good person. She's not just a good woman in whatever that meant in 1947. She's a good person. She tries to do right by everybody and tries to be forthright and all that. And not only does she survive the whole film, there's a case to be made that, in a sense, it's her story. That there was, it's not, but the structure of the film, starts off with her, with this man, and ends up, sort of, longing for this man, but realizing that, she might be better off making another choice. Of course, the choice is taken away, or the choice is made for her. But I think it's interesting that this movie has such a presence of a good woman and a good person throughout. And I think that probably helps make the contrast to Kathy even more stark, because I found Kathy, I've seen a lot of film noirs, I found Kathy to be one of the worst, one of the baddest women in noir, if you can believe it. I didn't find, I think there's at least an argument to be made that most of the other femme fatales at some point in the film were sincere in their affection for, or whatever word you want to use, the protagonist. I don't think she was, I don't think she ever sincerely cared for Mitchum. I don't think she ever stopped lying to everybody. And I think that she was an exceptionally dark figure, which helps in a couple ways, because Mitchum's no saint, but it makes him seem a bit better by comparison. And as I said, it makes Anne seem sparkling. You disagree, Jacob?
Yeah, I would say I read her a little bit differently, Andrew. Kathy is definitely not a saint. And, as you watch the film, we see her in the beginning in white, and by the end, she's wearing all black. I think the symbolism isn't lost on me or anybody else. But I I feel a lot of I think she's a more complex character than that. Yeah, there's a couple points that make me feel that way. And one is that it seems like there is this period where she and Mitchum, or she and Jeff, I keep saying Mitchum, she and Jeff do have this sort of kind of good life together. And it's not just a high flying life. It actually seems like a rather humble life, where they're, not, they're not high rolling. They're, they're taking it, they're living a pretty low profile life. Jeff certainly gets fixated on that period. And it seems at the end, she says something to him like, I think I wrote it down actually. She says, I never told you I was anything but what I am. You just wanted to imagine I was. That's why I left you. Now we're back to staying. So she kind of at the end is sort of trying to lead him back into that. The other sense I get about her, I think, is that she is in herself a tough situation, and she's playing the hand that's been dealt to her ruthlessly, but it's the hand she's been dealt. A moment that's always struck me is, there's that really memorable instant when Jeff is summoned to Kirk Douglas's Lake Tahoe house, and all of a sudden, Kathy comes out and joins them at the meal, and he glances at her and she says, she says, I couldn't help it. And it seems like that one sentence sort of contains a whole story of its own. And, I wonder what her situation is too. So yeah, I think she's definitely a dark character. I wouldn't dispute that. She's definitely a character who has a ruthlessness, and she's certainly involved in, I think, a destructive cycle. But I don't take her as one-dimensionally dark. I mean, I think there's room for her to have a sort of interesting story of her own,
No, I think her darkness has many dimensions. I just think every dimension is dark. I mean,
yeah.
I feel like she didn't have to. She didn't tell Mitchum about that she actually took the 40,000. She didn't have to kill his former partner. I feel like she really sort of. I feel like she was looking for opportunities to do the bad thing, and I kind of feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like with most of these femme fatales, there was a point where they told the truth, and maybe she tells the truth right at the end before they get shot, but the rest of the time she's nowhere near the truth, I don't think.
Sure. Indeed, I won't harp on about it, but let's just remember what Mitchum says to her when she asks, when the subject of the truth comes up. What does he say? Baby, I don't care.
Right. No. Oh, he doesn't care. Oh, no. He's in for a penny. He's in for a pound. He doesn't care. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean we all don't have to care. Let's see. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Hooray, I was hoping you'd call on me now, hoping. Okay, I don't want to beat it to death, but I think I have a different idea about the females. I am going to put up my hand in defense of the femme fatale in this movie. She was, Andrew, as you said, a terrible spider. She was awful. But I think perhaps she was as awful as she was because of Anne being in the movie. The other extreme was there. So we sort of have two sides. And I kind of feel like desirable guys in film noir can be gotten by the femme fatale and not by the other type of woman. You've got to be smart. You've got to be very, very sexy. You've got to be really beautiful. You've got to be cool. You've got to be able to do all those things to win over the kind of guy who's going to say a great line like, build my gallows high, baby, which I think the movie should have been called, frankly. So I don't know. There was something up about this that, on the women's side, that's how you get the guy that, you get the handsome guy when you're that kind of woman. I'm not saying it's right, but it sort of makes sense. Anne didn't get the guy. She really got the second level of guy. So anyway, I want to make another completely different point, and then I'll go. Directors always tell you in a show to physicalize, that is, find a prop or find something you can do to make a character really stand out, to help you bring it alive. This movie was a masterclass in physicalizing using a cigarette. I mean, I could not believe how brilliantly cigarettes and everything about them were used in this movie. I don't think anybody took more than 3 puffs of any cigarette, but they lit them. They threw out the match. There was the moment where Dickie Moore got the match thrown on his back. There were lighters. There were matches. There were everything great about a cigarette. And I thought, the poor lowly cigarette, we've lost it thanks to the Surgeon General and everything else. But what a great prop. What a great way to make character. So anyway, so that's my deal with the women. That's my deal with the cigarettes. There you go.
All right. Thanks, Dana. Regarding cigarettes, I read Roger Ebert's write-up on this movie because he considers it one of his great movies, and it is a great movie, and it belongs on that list and in the Library of Congress as well. But he points out that bit where he thought that there was so much cigarette smoking in this movie, even at a time when cigarette smoking was very common in movies, that it might have been a gag, because there's that moment where Robert Mitchum goes to see Kirk Douglas, and Kirk Douglas offers him a cigarette, and he holds one that he's already smoking up. He says, "Got one?" And
cigarette smoking.
Right. That's it. Thank you. Right. He's already got one going. And it's like, normally if you see that in movies, it's to show you how nervous the person is. It's not usually just kind of like a straight up gag, which is what that pretty much was. And that, so there must be something to what you were saying in that regard, Dana. And the other comment, you make a fair point. If the protagonist in these movies wasn't attracted to the characteristics of the femme fatale, this would be a very, very different genre. In fact, it very well might not exist. There are some film noirs where the good woman is desired and desirable, but they come much later in the cycle. I think about The Big Heat and Touch of Evil as examples. But again, those happen 9 and 17 years after film noir starts, by most counts. So by then the genre is sort of forced to make up some changes. So those are my thoughts on that. Jacob.
Yeah, thanks for your comment, Dana. I'll comment on both those things, as well. First of all, to the point of the femme fatale, one of the qualities of Kathy is that she's given this sort of aura of illusion and fantasy a little bit. One of the reasons that she hooks Mitchum, and then why this archetype perhaps hooks, film noir male protagonists, is because, right, she's this embodiment of this sort of fantasy. Remember the circumstances under which she's introduced in the film. Mitchum's been in the bar across the street from a movie theater. He's been nodding off, going in and out of sleep. He's listening to the music from the movie theater. He says this in the narration. And then she walks in from the light, in silhouette, and there's this sort of gleam behind her. So she's really presented sort of, with this kind of illusory aura. And indeed, I think, part of the key to understanding Mitchum's character, Jeff, is to understand that, his relationship to Kathy is not just with Kathy the woman, it's with a certain kind of fantasy of a woman. And I think that starts to help us understand why he acts as he does through the rest of the film. Let's talk about cigarettes for a second too. As Andrew said, Roger Ebert called this one of the best cigarette smoking movies of all time. I agree. It's used brilliantly and it's used expressively. There's a thematic element to it too, I think. One of the themes in Out of the Past, is it is about a complicated relationship with time. It's about, the film's called Out of the Past. It's about, one of the themes is sort of having, one's history and one's own personalized version of history sort of burst into the present and trying to synthesize those. And there's this sort of struggle with time in the film, struggle with time, with memory, with history, with the past. So how does this tie into cigarettes? This is my thinking. When you smoke a cigarette, you smoke a cigarette when you have a little time to kill. You take a cigarette break. You know, you don't think of one, I'm not a smoker, but you don't think of one smoking a cigarette while you're, you know, in the middle of rushing around or in the midst of an action. You smoke it when you have a little bit of time to kill. And Mitchum, curiously, smokes cigarettes often at moments where it seems like he doesn't have time to kill. I remember particularly the scene where he's stealing the files from the nightclub office. He walks in, socks the guy. You know, you would think he would grab the files and get out of there. And when he does get out, he rushes, you know. But in between that, he stops and he smokes a cigarette. So what's this all about? And how does this relate to the theme of time? To me, you know, I wonder if he has a very cool affect through the film, but he's a troubled character with some problems who is maybe not as cool as he thinks he is, I think. And I wonder if this sort of leisureliness about time that he shows in constantly smoking a cigarette and constantly having time to stop for a cigarette isn't a sort of way of trying to kind of master time or sort of deal with the sort of anxiety about time that he has in the film. I don't know, maybe that's highfalutin, but that's the way I think about it. So.
Well, that's interesting. There is a, you know, there is that phrase, smoke them if you got them. And that's usually uttered when there's people have to wait for something. So that's an interesting point. Let's see, Mark, you have a question or comment?
Hi, it's Janet. I just wanted to ask about two things. One was I was intrigued that she kept saying, I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. It's like happens 3 different times in the movie. I mean, even him by the last time she says it, he's like rolling his eyes. What is she meaning by that? I couldn't help it because I'm so locked into this situation with these powerful men that I can't help it because otherwise they'll kill me. Or I couldn't help it because that's just the kind of girl I am and it looked so appetizing. You know, where is she with that? And the other question I had, my husband Mark and I both wondered at the end of the movie, it seemed to me that he knew there was going to be a police roadblock and he was intentionally driving her right into it. The other vision of that is that he didn't, and he was trying to just do what she suggested and run away with her to someplace quiet. And I wonder what you thought about the ending.
Well, thanks for those questions or comments or both. I think that to take the last one first, I think that he knew what he was doing. He knew that police would be there, and one way or another, he wanted at least her to get caught. He was tired at the very least. He wanted to get off that merry-go-round. Regarding I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. I would say, and this won't surprise anyone who's been listening to the whole discussion, I would say that she was saying, you know, it was just too tempting. I'm just bad. Of course, you know, that's what I do, you know, that sort of thing. You know, kind of like if I sort of gave my 5-year-old a box of markers and left him in a completely empty room with these big white walls, and then I came back in half an hour and he had drawn all over them, he would say, I couldn't help it. And that's the sense I had. Because I don't get the sense that she was all that trapped. But, you know, that may just be me. Jacob.
Yeah, so I'll start with the end too. I guess the way that I read Jeff's character and the sort of driving relationship in the film, his sort of the sort of magnetic attraction to Kathy, is, you know, Jeff, I think, is fixated on her, and he's fixated on this time that they have had together it's an idealized time for him. And he keeps sort of trying to recreate it, even though the circumstances don't allow it. And, he, for various reasons. So, we see this kind of cycle that he goes through a couple different times, through the movie, where he goes away from her and he comes back, and he goes away from her and he comes back, where he keeps trying to get away and he comes back to her. And I think he just finds her too irresistible. He can't quit it. And I think, it's obviously a destructive relationship. And I think some people were commenting about this in the chat, but it seems like he makes a phone call before he gets in the car with her, which I've always interpreted as him notifying the police. So I think this was, I think he, I interpret it as him sort of recognizing that they're sort of going to their death together, which is really the sort of ultimate end of that sort of mutually destructive relationship. Now, to the question of her saying, I can't help it. Well, you raise the question, is it because of her circumstances? She's trapped by these powerful men, or is it because of her pathology? This is just how she is, and this is just what she does. And I sort of think, we don't see Kathy's side of the story enough to really say for sure, but I think it could be both. This kind of ties into some of the themes that, course through the noir genre, which is this one of entrapment and fatalism, and the sort of confinement, by circumstance. Sometimes it is by external, scenarios. And perhaps it is the case where, that she is sort of detained or, at risk of some violence or something like that, if she breaks away, if she tries to leave wit or whatever it is, and she's trying to sort of manipulate her way out. But I think it's equally, I think it's equally possible that this is just how she is, and this is just what she does. And this is, I think, and I think that speaks to the way that Out of the Past in general treats noir's relationship with this fatalism, which is not just tying it to sort of external circumstances, be that a corrupt system or an organized, crime organization or whatever it is, but to a sort of personal tendency, a personal pathology. These characters who are stuck in these behavior patterns that they can't break away from, and that they're powerless over, and that leads them, despite themselves and perhaps despite their, better judgment towards destruction.
Yeah, I agree. This film is a really strong sort of representation of the fatalism streak in film noir. And I think that has a lot to do with how the characters act and how things go. Let's see. Ellen, do you have a question or comment? No. Kenneth, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I wanted to see if people felt the same way, but my interpretation at the ending was that he was turning her into the police. That, as some people have mentioned in the chat, that he had made a phone call ahead of time. And that was going to be, that he was not trying to run away with her. I really think that it seemed to me, he realized that he preferred the life where he was much quieter, and it was with Anne, I think her name was, who he seemed to be very happy with. And there's only, how many times can Kathy double cross him before he realizes you just can't trust her?
Well, Kenneth, I think that that's what we were just saying. I think we, all signs do point to the fact that whether he was going to try to turn her in and get away himself, or whether he was looking at the police to sort of end them and end her. I think we agree on that.
Okay. I am not a big fan, as I think it was David who said, of endings where everybody ends up killed. But I really did like the character. And to me, that, I don't know if it's necessarily a film noir thing, but these detectives with the fedora hat and the trench coat that are usually have a somewhat fatalistic attitude about their life, but they also always seem to be a step ahead of things. That he knew he was being set up with that whole scene. He knew that he was being set up to take the blame for a murder, but he always managed to be in the right place at the right time, to be a step ahead, so that they couldn't catch up to him and they couldn't double cross him. And that was the part I liked about him. I thought he played that character well. And you see that extended, I think, more of TV characters. If anybody watched Breaking Bad, the character Mike was like that. He was the guy who always got things done and always kind of had his ear to the ground and knew what everybody was doing. And I saw Robert Mitchum like that a little bit too, that he didn't have to be that involved to know who was doing what and how he was going to be set up for it. And my other question is, why at the end, it seemed like the young man, the deaf man who worked for him, when Anne asked him, was Jeff going to run away with that woman? And he seemed to indicate yes, which I think was not true. Now, did I miss something here? I don't remember his name. Did he think that Jeff was running away with Kathy?
Okay, Ken, thank you very much. We will talk about that. I think that it's pretty clear that he was saying that the kid at the end was saying that as a way to sort of release Anne from any obligation she might feel toward the Robert Mitchum character, to make her mourning of him or missing of him be that much easier by believing, or at least being told, that he had chosen the other woman over her. And I think it's a way to sort of let her get on with her life, as easily as possible. Jacob, what do you think?
No, I think that's on point too. It's a nice touch on Tourneur's part, because it gives the character sort of deafness and an ability to speak, a sort of it comes into play at the end, because it retains some ambiguity. Yeah, I mean, I think that's how I would tend to read it too. But there's a sort of unknowability about his motivations ultimately, I think. We can't say for sure what he's doing. I think it is equally possible that it doesn't seem like he was convinced that they could get away together, Jeff and Kathy, but it does seem possible that he could have A, been trying to turn her into the police and didn't go that way, that B, that it was some sort of self-destructive sort of suicide, mission. Or, I mean, I don't know, perhaps there are viewers who, interpret it as the two of them really trying to go off together. But I do, it's a sort of ambiguity that the film retains, and I think gives it, some power. But yeah, I mean, I do think the kid is really a sort of part, the closest thing we have to an impartial onlooker. Jeff is the narrator a lot, but he's a subjective narrator. He's not the most objective, the most objective judge of events. And the kid, the kid is our sort of neutral onlooker. Yeah.
Something else that Kenneth said that's been sort of alluded to or mentioned in the chat about both of them dying at the end. And more people die at the end, but those two die at the very end. The question was asked in the chat, and I think this is related to Kent's question, which is that because it's film noir, or is that because of the code, the production code, Hollywood self-censorship regime required, payment for past bad deeds? And I think the answer to that question is yes. We see it goes along with the fatalistic streak and the sort of, natural end of, as Jacob said, the result of the pathologies that characters have, that they end up dead. But some of them at least have to end up dead. I mean, Kathy killed dead at least two people when it didn't appear she had to. So she had to die for those. And I can't remember everything Mitchum did, but I'm sure he did some things that probably warranted it as well. So in this movie, it's both. And in film noir, it is often one or the other. Let's see. Ellen, you're back with us. Ellen, do you have a question or comment? Okay, then we will go to Janice.
Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to go back for a moment to the cigarettes because I believe was the film 1947.
Mhm.
I was wondering if the advertising industry, the cigarette advertising industry, was yet involved in getting their products on the film, because they certainly, if they didn't, they got a lot of advertising, whether or not they did, all the way around. Because I really think a bit about, whenever I see these films from then, how not just the smoking of cigarettes, but the way they were done and the circumstances in which they were used played a huge part in addicting us. I mean, they're really used very much sexually, so that, you know, every time someone has sex afterward, they smoke a cigarette, and making it very appealing. So I was wondering if perhaps they were starting to pay to have a lot of exposure in movies.
I don't think they were doing that at this time. I don't think they needed to. I think smoking was a much more popular and widely accepted, activity in 1947 than it would be even 20 or 30 years later. I also think that it seems like perhaps one executive at one company might have had that idea, but if he did, he didn't do a very good job, because I couldn't tell you what brand they were smoking. So I don't think it was any form of product placement, though that does come into the industry later. I don't think that's what's happening here.
Yeah. Can I weigh in briefly? Yeah, I'm not sure about the question of product placement either, but I think it brings to mind, it's a good point to mention one of the sort of stars of the film who doesn't appear on screen, which is the cinematographer, Nicholas Musaraka. When you read accounts of the production of the film, one of the things you read about is the great lengths that Musaraka went to capture smoke, exhaled smoke, in the way that he does. So, whether, I don't know about the question of whether there was a product placement or that kind of angle, but certainly if there was or even if it was just a sort of commonplace activity of, a commonplace representation of people's smoking habits at the time, the sort of style and visual effect of the act of smoking was certainly not lost on. It was in fact very strategically used and played up by the production team, especially cinematographer Nicholas Musaraka, who gives the film such a memorable style.
Let's see, Ellen, I see you're ready to go.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. I wondered if you'd comment on the way Kathy was dressed at the end of the film. It really struck me that she was dressed like a nun, and in the rest of the film, she had on sexy, slim clothing, and she looked beautiful. And when she walked out of her apartment, she was dressed in this gray habit, and she had this thing over her head, and her blonde hair wasn't showing. So I wondered if you'd comment on that.
Jacob, I don't really have any organized thoughts on that. I noticed it, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. Did you have any thoughts?
Well, I don't have a totally good answer either. I noticed that as well. I mean, to me, she looks either like a nun, which you think of as somebody holy and pure, or like somebody in mourning, or somebody who's attending a funeral, which would be in keeping with the sort of harbinger of death, kind of attributes that we've given to her. So I don't know, perhaps this is one of the ways that the film kind of leans in or leaves some ambiguity for multiple interpretations too. It's an interesting observation. I'm not totally sure what to do with it. Yeah.
I mean, I guess you can dress for mourning if you're the reason the person you're mourning is dead. So maybe she was mourning Kirk Douglas. Or maybe it was the old Cannonball Run 2 trick where she thought if they get stopped by the police or anybody else, if she was dressed as a nun, they might be let go a little bit more easily. So
Yeah.
two possibilities.
Or maybe she was mourning herself.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, she would have had to, I think, had to have learned some sort of lesson. Then it doesn't seem she did, but that's an interesting take, certainly. Mark, you have a question or comment?
Hi there, it's Janet again.
Hi.
I wanted you both to address the issue of the kid. He struck me like an author, a screenwriter, whatever they are, has made an active decision to make a central character unable to hear or speak. And yet he has virtually the last line almost. He reminded me of some kind of a Greek head of the chorus who, you know, can neither speak nor something, but sees all and has this interesting overview of the situation. Why is he there? What is your take on that, both of you? Why can he not hear and speak?
Thanks for that, Janet. You know, Jacob mentioned this a little while ago that he thought he was sort of, you know, I think this lines up, Jacob's comment earlier lines up nicely with your comment just now about the Greek chorus, a sort of, you know, neutral or distanced observer. What I would say is that I think his association with, I'd say two things. One is, I think a lot of times in fiction and certainly in film, characters with disabilities or characters who have some sort of, you know, unique for the film attribute are seen as having special abilities, having not you know, a unique degree of insight or something sort of almost magical about them. And I think here, you know, the thought is that because he has those attributes, there's something sort of extra decent about him, and that we don't need to wonder about his motives, because the movie's not going to make a character like that anything but sort of pure. And by that, his loyalty to, faith in, fondness for the Mitchum character transfers some, you know, positive value to the Mitchum character that helps further distinguish him from Kirk Douglas or Kathy or the other sort of people he finds himself with. Jacob, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I appreciate the comment, and I think the Greek chorus reference is well placed, right? You know, we're used to expecting the character, we're used to expecting the voiceover to work as a sort of impartial narrator. Not here, you know, and so he's the way that we sort of get that. Now, as for, I think, you know, Andrew, you framed this well, but right, there is this sort of tendency in older movies to, like, you know, bestow this kind of special status on characters with disabilities, you know, and I think that perhaps is in play here too, especially because so much of this movie, among the other characters, is about people deceiving other people and deluding themselves, you know, talking each other or talking themselves into believing things that are misleading or are deluded or are deceptions. Or that are sort of false versions of the true situation. And, you know, and I wonder if, you know, the way that the film uses this character, because he doesn't, you know, speak, is if, right, there's this sort of, they bestow on him this sort of purity of language that the other characters don't have, you know.
Let's see. Barbara, you have a question or comment? Okay, well, while we see if Barbara comes through, I did want to ask you, Jacob, about something that came up in the chat which was that we haven't really talked about, which is Kirk Douglas and his character. I found his presence in this film refreshing, and I found his type of villain, even though it's one we have seen many times in the 70 plus years since this movie came out, I feel like for the era, it was a relatively kind of fresh take on the sort of big bad. What are your thoughts on Douglas and his character?
I mean, I think it's a great performance. This is a really young Kirk Douglas. I think it's not his first role, but I think it's before Detective Story, which is usually described as his first like real breakout film. Right. I think you've put it well. It's great because he's cheerful. He's not explosive. He's well-mannered and totally sinister through the whole film, except for at the end we see, we get a real indication of this sort of violent, sort of vicious side of him. The other thing that strikes me is that he's stuck on Kathy too. We don't get a whole lot of deep insight about his character. We see him mostly in the functional role of the villain, but she shot him. She took $40,000 from her, and he doesn't care about the money or the bullet. So one of the things that I think is special about the film is it leaves us room to imagine, the inner lives of characters who don't really play major roles in the film, but it also, sort of speaks to this sort of a sort of parallel between Mitchum and Douglas. They both caught the hook.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, Andrew?
No, they totally do. And it's something we, you see in these movies that in a way I appreciate it because it communicates to us that there must really be something about Kathy, because it's not only one guy who keeps going after her clearly against his interest. It is, as you said, someone that she shot and stole a lot of money from, who takes her back. And he obviously doesn't just take her back, he sort of forces her to come back. But I do think that's interesting. The other thing I thought was interesting, sort of in terms of Kirk Douglas's star text, is I'm so used to seeing the sort of, we often see the pleasant seeming Kirk Douglas, and that sort of that jutting chin and that clenched jaw and the slight whine underneath is a way in most of his career to show us a sort of righteous indignation under that pleasantness, like we saw in much of Paths of Glory. Here, it's a way of showing the menace and rage under that pleasant exterior. And it sort of makes me, wish that as he got to be a bigger star and was sort of more in his prime, he played more bad guys. I know that's not how Hollywood works. That wasn't going to happen, but it certainly would have been interesting, I think.
Yeah. If anyone out there's seen Ace in the Hole, that's like another totally ferocious Kirk Douglas part. And right, he's great in it. He's great in this. And yeah, I would have loved to see him do those kinds of furious roles more too. Yeah.
Right. Use that chin for evil, not just good.
Not just righteous indignation.
Right. Let's see. James, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I was interested in the character of Jack, who I didn't quite understand his motivation, because I think they'd been partners in the past, but he seemed very determined to sort of track Jeff down, and I wondered whether I missed something or whether there was some sort of reason why he was kind of needed for the plot to kind of work out, to have a former friend sort of on his tail for the first half of the film, apart from obviously him needing to get shot.
Right. So thanks for that. I think that he feels owed 50% of the fee that Mitchum was going to get for tracking down Kathy, and and that was a lot of money. And also, he thought what he was owed, even though he wasn't doing the job. They sort of said outside of Kirk Douglas's office, we're partners. I still get 50%, right? And Mitchum at least tacitly agrees. And so I think that's part of the reason. The other reason, from a plot perspective, I think, is there has to be a wrench that gets thrown in the happy life that Kathy and Jeff are living down in Mexico way. And I think that is as good a one as any. He's going to get paid for finding them, or he's going to get the money from Mitchum. Two good reasons for him to do the work, and then good reason for him to be there to be the fly in the ointment. Jacob.
Yeah, this is a good question. Let's talk about it from a plot perspective, and then let's talk about it from a theme perspective. So from a plot perspective, I think we actually hear at a certain point that he's been hired by Whit, by Kirk Douglas's character, to track him. I think Mitchum says to him, "You're working for him now," and he says, "Who else?" So. But speaking to kind of how it figures into the theme, and follow my train of thought here. So we've talked a little bit about how the film has this sort of repetitive cycle. Mitchum has this romance, they're split, they come back together. And so one of the things that we see through the film is these sort of recurrences and these repetitions. And so you'll notice there's a lot of like doubles in the film, where there's, these types in which there are two. So in the first half of the film, right, we see Robert Mitchum pursued by his former partner, Jack Fisher. In the second half of the film, we have a character who does the same thing, which is Stephanos, and there's various other doubles that we see through the film too. There's Jose Rodriguez, the guide, and there's the cabbie, who drives him around. There's the two names that Jeff has, Jeff Markham and Jeff Bailey. So, the film sort of folds in half in this way. And I think, one of the things that, Fisher does is sort of mirror Stephanos, because what's happening to Mitchum is he's doing the same thing again and again and again. And he keeps trying to reset himself and do it differently. And then all the same stuff happens. So right. I think Fisher shows up. There are plot reasons for him to show up, but it's also sort of, he's built into the sort of structure of the film too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. He does sort of serve that role. There is that kind of like, henchman who sort of turns on him sort of figure in both portions of the movie. So that makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Okay, we'll give Barbara one more try. Barbara? All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for tonight's discussion of Out of the Past. We hope you enjoyed the film. We'll have another discussion a week from tonight. The film will be announced in our Thursday email. You can also join us for our upcoming seminar on Ingmar Bergman a week from tomorrow night, September 1st at 6:30, taught by Jennifer Flieger. We will also, that's not our last remote classroom seminar. We'll have a bunch more in September and October. Those will be announced in the Thursday email, where you can also find out about Monday's film and discussion. And if you haven't signed up for our weekly emails, that is the way to find out about what's going on in Film Studies Online, what's going on in Theater 5, where we've got a lot of great new films that you can only see by streaming them through us. And we also have lots of other fun things going on at our website, brynmarfilm.org. So please visit Theater 5, please visit Film Studies Online. And if you like what we're doing and have the means, please consider making a donation to help keep BMFI running and make sure we're strong and ready to hit the ground running once we're able to reopen. Until that time, or at least until a week from tonight, thank you very much for joining us, and we really appreciate it, and we love these opportunities to discuss film and look forward to doing it when we're all back in the theater or in our seminar room and able to do it then. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Again.
Thank you.